Some Hollywood legends didn't lose everything because of scandal, blacklists, or bad luck. They lost it because they were simply too foolish to see what was right in front of them. One actor turned down 3 of the greatest scripts ever written, for reasons so shallow they still sound like a joke today. Another spent his entire adult life acting like a child star even after the cameras stopped rolling, until one petty argument ended his life at 31. A 5-time Olympic champion became a global icon without ever learning to act, and spent his final years wandering a nursing home, still doing the same jungle yell for strangers. These aren't stories of villains. They're stories of men who had everything, and quietly threw it away through nothing more than pure, avoidable stupidity. Stick around, because actor number 1's mistake directly created one of the greatest movie stars who ever lived. Number 1, George Raft, the star who built Bogart's career by accident. Picture this: you're one of the biggest names at Warner Brothers, gangster roles practically written for your face, and 3 scripts land on your desk that will go down as some of the most important films ever made. You say no to all 3. That's exactly what George Raft did in the early 1940s, and the reasons weren't complicated artistic disagreements. They were embarrassingly petty. He turned down High Sierra because he didn't like that his character died at the end. He walked away from The Maltese Falcon because he refused to work with some unproven rookie director named John Huston. Behind the scenes, insiders knew Raft barely read his own scripts. He'd have assistants summarize the plot for him, then make career-altering decisions based on a 2-minute recap. Warner Brothers didn't bother trying to fix him. They didn't sit him down for a heart-to-heart. They simply suspended his pay and handed his rejected roles straight to a struggling contract player named Humphrey Bogart. The rest is film history. Raft's real problem was that he'd confused his tough guy public image, bolstered by real friendships with mobsters like Bugsy Siegel, with genuine acting talent. He treated Hollywood like an extension of the underworld instead of a profession that demanded growth. When post-war audiences started craving morally complex antiheroes, exactly the type Bogart was now perfecting, Raft had nothing. No range, no reinvention, no plan B. By the 1950s the phone stopped ringing entirely. He ended up greeting guests at a London casino, trading on the memory of a career he'd handed away one bad call at a time. But if you think Raft's ego was destructive, wait until you hear about the child star who never figured out he wasn't a kid anymore, and it cost him his life. Number 2, Carl Alfalfa, Switzer child star who never grew up, and paid with his life. Every kid in the 1950s knew the cowlick, the freckles, and the deliberately awful singing voice. Carl Alfalfa Switzer was one of the most recognizable faces in America thanks to the Our Gang shorts. But Hollywood has a brutal habit with child stars. It builds them up, profits off their youth, then discards them the moment they're not cute anymore, and never teaches them how to survive what comes next. Switzer's real downfall wasn't aging out of the role. It was that he genuinely never understood the game had changed. As a kid at Hal Roach Studios, he was treated like royalty, free to pull pranks and disrupt sets because he was too valuable to discipline. But once he grew into an awkward, lanky young man, he expected that same red carpet treatment. He showed up to sets demanding star treatment he hadn't earned in years, acting entitled instead of humble, arrogant instead of hungry. He never bothered learning the deeper craft that mature roles required. He just leaned on an inflated sense of self-importance that burned bridge after bridge with directors and co-stars who found him simply impossible to work with. The industry that built his ego didn't care about the psychological whiplash of losing child stardom. They just saw a washed-up actor who wasn't useful anymore. Left to scrape by, Switzer bounced between odd jobs, including work as a hunting guide, all while making increasingly reckless decisions, as if consequences were something that happened to other people. That mindset caught up with him for good in early 1959. An argument over a lost hunting dog and a $50 reward spiraled into a violent confrontation Switzer refused to back down from. He was dead at 31, not from some glamorous Hollywood scandal, but from a lifelong failure to understand the real weight of his own actions. Number 3, Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic champion who couldn't say a sentence. Johnny Weissmuller became one of the highest-paid actors on the planet for one specific reason: The studio realized he was physically incapable of delivering convincing dialogue. As a 5-time Olympic swimming champion, he had the perfect body to play Tarzan in the 1930s. But the moment MGM put him in front of a camera, they hit a wall. The man simply couldn't act. He struggled to memorize basic lines, and his delivery was painfully stiff. So instead of training him, the studio built an entire character around his limitations. They gutted his dialogue down to grunts and broken English, and manufactured his now iconic yell entirely in post-production. They didn't need an artist. They needed a profitable, photogenic statue, and that's precisely what they got. Weissmuller was completely fine with this. He never seemed to grasp just how thoroughly he was being managed. For nearly 20 years he swung from vine to vine, blissfully unaware that his entire career rested on a narrow, engineered gimmick. He never pushed for harder roles, never questioned his contracts, never tried to actually learn the craft. He just kept playing the Jungle King until he aged out of the loincloth, and the calls quietly stopped. Once he stepped outside MGM's protective bubble, his total lack of real-world savvy became painfully obvious. He made a string of gullible, disastrous investments and burned through 5 marriages. He'd spent his prime years being managed like a product by executives who only cared about box office returns, and when they were finished with him, he had zero practical skills to survive on his own. In his final years, living in a care facility, Number 4 John Agar, the man who got everything for free, and blew it anyway. John Agar landed the most exclusive golden ticket in Hollywood without a single competitive audition. He didn't train, he didn't grind, he didn't pay his dues. He simply had the right jawline, and more importantly, he married Shirley Temple. To studio executives in the late 1940s, Agar wasn't a discovered talent, he was a built-in publicity machine. Producer David O. Selznick signed him immediately, and legendary director John Ford placed him right alongside John Wayne and Henry Fonda in the prestige Western Fort Apache. Suddenly surrounded by the biggest names in the industry, Agar completely misread the assignment. He mistook a manufactured PR opportunity for genuine, irreplaceable talent. Rather than recognizing how fragile his position actually was and working desperately to catch up, he coasted. He showed up to sets unprepared, fumbling basic lines, treating a cutthroat industry like a casual country club. His off-screen life mirrored the same obliviousness, a string of DUI arrests, and embarrassing tabloid headlines, all fueled by the delusion that his looks and his marriage made him untouchable. But the studio system never protects dead weight once the profit disappears. When Shirley Temple filed for divorce in 1949, Agar's invisible shield vanished overnight. Without her star power to hide behind, executives finally saw what had always been true: he still couldn't act, and he had zero discipline. They'd milked the marriage for every ounce of free press it was worth, and the moment it ended, so did their patience. Agar spent the following decades drifting into cheap, Z-grade monster movies, a steep fall from sharing a screen with John Wayne. His career didn't evaporate because of shifting tastes. It evaporated because a golden ticket means nothing if you refuse to learn the job. Number 5 Wallace Beery, the highest paid star who couldn't understand his own script. In the early 1930s, the highest paid actor at the most powerful studio on earth wasn't some polished leading man. It was Wallace Beery, a hulking, heavy-set character actor who genuinely struggled to comprehend his own dialogue. Beery won an Academy Award and dominated the box office playing one specific type over and over, the slow-witted brute with a hidden heart of gold. Audiences thought they were watching brilliant, subtle acting. The directors who actually worked with him knew a very different truth. Beery wasn't acting at all. That confusion and slowness on set was simply who he was, dressed up as a performance the public couldn't get enough. Number 6 Bela Lugosi, the man who turned down immortality out of vanity. Bela Lugosi had just pulled off one of the great career triumphs in Hollywood history. His 1931 performance as Count Dracula turned him into an overnight sensation and reportedly helped save Universal Studios from bankruptcy. Naturally, the studio wanted to strike while the iron was hot. They were adapting another Gothic classic, Frankenstein, and everyone assumed Lugosi would step into the lead. There was just one catch: The producers didn't want him playing the Mad Doctor. They wanted him as the monster. Lugosi agreed to a screen test, and it's here that his ego took over completely. An argument broke out with the makeup team over what the creature should look like, and when Lugosi realized the role would bury his face under heavy prosthetics and strip him of nearly all dialogue, he refused outright, reportedly dismissing the part as fit only for a half-wit extra. He didn't want to be unrecognizable. He didn't want to be silent. He wanted to be a leading man, not a lumbering prop. That decision handed the role, and the role of a lifetime, to a little-known actor named Boris Karloff, whose haunting, sympathetic performance made him an instant global star and the new face of horror cinema. Lugosi, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines as the exact kind of iconic, career-defining part he turned down became the most famous monster in movie history. It was a mistake he never recovered from. As Karloff's star kept rising through Bride of Frankenstein and The Mummy, Lugosi slid further down the cast lists, spending the rest of his career chasing the kind of stardom he'd once refused to share the screen with, as a creature. But vanity wasn't the only career killer in old Hollywood. Sometimes all it took was trusting the wrong contract, even when your closest friends begged you not to sign it. Number 7. Buster Keaton, the genius who signed away his own career. By the late 1920s, Buster Keaton wasn't just a movie star, he was one of the most successful independent filmmakers alive. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in his own films, controlling every creative decision down to the smallest stunt. He owned a mansion in Beverly Hills next door to Rudolph Valentino, earned the modern equivalent of $60,000 a week, and had built, from scratch, exactly the kind of complete artistic freedom that most performers could only dream of. Then, in 1928, he threw it all away, willingly. Keaton signed a contract handing his career over to MGM, chasing the promise of financial security and studio backing. Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, two of his closest peers, personally warned him not to do it. They told him he'd lose the independence that made him who he was. Keaton didn't listen. He trusted a promise from a friend that nothing would really change. Everything changed. MGM assigned him teams of writers, forced him through script committees, and buried his improvisational genius under corporate bureaucracy built for actors who needed that structure, not for a man whose entire creative process depended on the freedom to invent as he went. When Keaton pushed back and refused to make films he considered inferior, the studio simply fired him for being difficult. The loss of control sent him spiraling into alcoholism, and the man who once built the single most expensive and celebrated stunt shot in movie history was reduced to churning out films he despised. He later called it, in his own words, the worst mistake of his life, a rare case of a Hollywood legend destroying his own empire not through scandal or stupidity in the moment, but by handing away the keys of his own free will. If you think losing creative control was rough, wait until you hear about the child star turned biggest name in Hollywood, who couldn't hold on to a single dollar of it. Number 8. Mickey Rooney, Hollywood's biggest earner who died with $18,000. At the peak of the 1930s, Mickey Rooney wasn't just a star. He was the single biggest box office draw in the entire world, out-earning every other actor in Hollywood as MGM's beloved Andy Hardy. By the late 1970s he was pulling in the modern equivalent of nearly $300,000 a week. Across an astonishing 9-decade career and over 300 films, Rooney generated what should have been one of the great fortunes in entertainment history. He blew through nearly all of it. Rooney married 8 times, and the divorce settlements alone drained millions. His fourth wife's payout in 1958 would be worth over $4 million today. He was a compulsive gambler who couldn't walk away from the racetrack or the card table, chasing losses with borrowed money for years on end. Old studio contracts didn't include residuals or royalties, so unlike modern actors, Rooney never earned a cent from any of his films airing again. Every dollar had to come from active, ongoing work, and the moment the job slowed down, so did the income. By 1962 he filed for bankruptcy with just $500 in cash against $500,000 in debt. He clawed his way back only to lose it all over again, filing bankruptcy a second time in 1996. In his final years, He even had to sue his own stepson in court, alleging the man had mismanaged and drained what little money he had left. When Mickey Rooney died in 2014 at age 93, one of the highest-paid performers who ever lived, his entire estate was valued at just $18,000. It's one of the starkest reminders in Hollywood history that a fortune earned isn't the same as a fortune kept, and that talent alone was never enough to save these men from themselves. Number 9. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who drank away his own legend. You're the single biggest action star on the planet, the man whose name literally became slang for effortless success. Like Flynn, and within a decade, your own reputation has become the thing that destroys you. That's exactly what happened to Errol Flynn, and it wasn't studio politics or bad scripts that did it. It was his own reckless choices, piling up one after another until there was nothing left to protect him. By the early 1940s, Flynn had it all: leading roles in Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, a reputation as Hollywood's most charming rogue, and a public image built entirely on the idea that his wild lifestyle was just harmless fun. Then, in late 1942, 2 teenage girls accused him of statutory rape, one incident allegedly on his own yacht. The trial became a national sensation, and though a jury acquitted him in 1943, the damage to his image was permanent. Insiders would later say the trial marked the real beginning of his decline, both personally and professionally. Rather than course-correcting, Flynn doubled down on exactly the behavior that had put him there. His drinking spiraled into full-blown alcoholism. By his final years he was reportedly working through 2 liters of vodka a day, while his health collapsed under the weight of it, leaving him looking decades older than his real age. His last film, a low-budget vanity project, paired him on-screen with his final girlfriend, a relationship that had started when she was just 15. Flynn died at 50, physically wrecked and professionally irrelevant, having spent the back half of his career quietly dismantling the very legend his early films had built. But if you think a scandal could kill a career slowly, wait until you see how one 3-day party ended a beloved comedian's career in a single week. Number 10. Roscoe, fatty. Arbuckle, the comedy king who lost everything over one party. Picture this: you're the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, a beloved comedian who's just signed a contract worth the modern equivalent of tens of millions of dollars, and within 1 week, a single party turns you into the most hated man in America, permanently, regardless of what the courts eventually decide. That's exactly what happened to Roscoe, fatty Arbuckle in September 1921, and while the full truth of that night remains disputed to this day, what's certain is that Arbuckle's own choices around that weekend set the disaster in motion. Arbuckle was Paramount's top star, having just signed a 3-year, $3 million contract, when he decided to celebrate with a lavish, alcohol-fueled Labor Day party at a San Francisco hotel, during Prohibition, no less, when simply hosting that kind of gathering was already a legal risk. Actress Virginia Raft fell seriously ill during the party and died days later. Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter, and the sensationalized press coverage that followed painted him as a monster before he ever set foot in a courtroom. He went through 3 grueling trials. The first 2 ended in hung juries. It wasn't until the 3rd, in 1922, that a jury acquitted him in just 5 minutes, and even issued a formal written apology, stating that acquittal wasn't enough for what he'd been put through. But by then it didn't matter. Hollywood studios, desperate to distance the industry from scandal, banned him from the screen outright. Arbuckle attempted a comeback directing films under a fake name, but the damage was permanent. He spiraled into alcoholism and died of heart failure at just 46, a legally innocent man whose one reckless decision to throw that party cost him everything he'd built. And that's all 11. From Raft's stubborn ego to Arbuckle's fatal party, the pattern never changes. Hollywood didn't destroy these men,